Hello, Facebook Live. So if for some reason at any point the microphone doesn't work properly and the sound goes goofy, let me know. But I'm going to assume that everything is okay because my talk about GMO this morning on Facebook Live worked out just fine. So today I am talking about MSG, monosodium glutamate. And this is a super common ingredient that is put into packaged food products. And the reason is because it makes food delicious. I remember being a kid and my dad's family had a grocery store and I used to work in the grocery store. And they used to still then sell containers of MSG. If you ever used Accent, then that's MSG. And they don't sell that. I don't think they sell that anymore. Or if they do, not very much of it because people are more aware now of what it is and the issues that it causes. But we're going to talk about that now. So MSG was discovered by Japanese. They found that this substance made food so delicious that people couldn't resist it and that they wanted more of it. And so they now make it and sell it to everybody all over the world so that it contributes this deliciousness flavor that makes foods irresistible. And producers of packaged foods have learned that one way to get people to buy more of their food is to put this deliciousness into it. So MSG is a really common food put into packaged foods for that reason. But they now know that people want to avoid it, and so they find ways to avoid putting MSG or monosodium glutamate on the label because they know that people like me who are label readers will not buy that food if it says MSG on it or monosodium glutamate. Now you can still find some foods that actually do still have it on the label. Most likely those are going to be things like bouillon, but foods like that have so much MSG in it that they're even willing to put it on the label. So what is the issue with MSG? Why would someone want to avoid having it in their food? Let's talk about what MSG is and how it works. Monosodium glutamate. So the problems come about because glutamate is an amino acid and it's a neurotransmitter. Okay, so it's a neurotransmitter that our bodies use to regulate how our nervous system functions and how our bodies in general function. So glutamate is a substance that in the brain, in the nervous system, causes neurons, nerve cells, to activate. And so if you have a neuron here that is regulated by glutamate, when glutamate comes around, okay, and it gets to that neuron, the neuron opens up a channel that allows calcium in. Okay, so it's a glutamate gated on the calcium channel. And so you have this neuron here, and glutamate comes, it attaches, and then the calcium channel opens, and calcium floods into the cell. What would normally cause that calcium channel to close again is magnesium. So if you are having a lot of glutamate and you are deficient in magnesium, the calcium channel can wind up staying open all the time because you don't have enough magnesium coming in to close the calcium channel and you've got lots of glutamate. Okay, so if you have a neuron, okay, on the wall of the neuron, there's a calcium channel that's gated with glutamate, right? And so glutamate comes, opens the calcium channel, calcium floods in. So when that happens, calcium floods in, calcium floods in, calcium floods in, so much that the neuron can swell up and die. So, too much glutamate causes too much excitation of the nerves. They swell up with calcium and they die. Meaning, you can have some of your neurons, some of your brain cells, and I imagine this happens in other areas of the body too, but it's most noticeable when it comes to the brain. So you can have brain cells being killed off if you consume a lot of glutamate. So if you think about the symptoms of what used to be called Chinese restaurant syndrome, okay, where you would have, fuzzy brain or, swelling in your limbs or just a whole variety of different symptoms of just not feeling well after eating Chinese food, because they used to put a lot of glutamate in the food in Chinese restaurants, but other restaurants and packaged foods. So it's like, if you notice you have symptoms associated with those things. Now, realistically, part of it might be if you have too much blood sugar, right? If there's too much sweet stuff in it, too much starchy stuff in it, then that can cause a blood sugar escalation and then a blood sugar crash. So some of the symptoms could come from that. Okay, but then there's a bunch of other symptoms that could come about just from exposure to the MSG and possibly other chemicals there, but we're just going to stick with MSG for now. Okay, so for me, what I notice when I have had foods that contain MSG is that I get swelling, a little bit of swelling in my fingers and in my feet and a little bit in my ankles. So I mostly avoid MSG, at least when it comes to packaged foods. What often happens when I go to restaurants, however, is I realize that I must have had something that had MSG in it because I get that little bit of swelling. And that's my indication that that's what's going on. Okay, so for you to understand that MSG is one of those things, like we've talked about with packaged foods and with GMOs in the past. Okay, if you have this ingredient that's added to foods every day, you're always going to be having an excessive amount of glutamate that's causing these problems in your health. And that you might be doing damage to yourself. Let's talk more about the brain. I realize that I want to do more about that. Okay, so I learned about this in Russell Blaylock's book, Excitotoxins: The Taste That Kills. And I knew before then that MSG was bad, but I didn't really understand why. Reading that book by Russell Blaylock, Excitotoxins: The Taste That Kills, okay, he explained this whole thing about the calcium channels in the neurons, and that when you have the glutamate, the neurons die. Okay, but glutamate is very important for brain function and brain development. So it's a neurotransmitter that is important for us to have. So we need a small amount. This is such an important neurotransmitter that the brain has very sensitive control mechanisms for making sure there's not too much and that there is enough. Because if there isn't enough, then the body needs to generate more, right? So it produces it from proteins or it pulls it out of storage. I don't know if there's storage of glutamate, but if there's too much, then the brain has a lot of mechanisms that it uses to be able to pull it out of circulation because it's toxic if there's too much, right? So this is such an important neurotransmitter that our bodies control the amount of it very, very carefully. So what happens when we eat food that has MSG in it, right? You have a large amount of this chemical that floods into your bloodstream, and some of it winds up crossing over the blood-brain barrier into your brain and then affecting your brain cells. When reading Excitotoxins: The Taste That Kills, that book by Russell Blaylock, in the book he said that you can lose 90% of the neurons that perform a certain function and not notice any symptoms. You don't notice symptoms of loss of function in your brain until you have lost, according to him, 90% of the brain cells, the neurons that perform that function. Now, that's probably an imprecise number, right? They don't know exactly how many neurons there are and how many it takes to have symptoms, but basically, if you notice that you've got a symptom of neurological function being impaired, okay, then that means that you have already lost a massive percentage of the neurons that perform that function. So when you start having foggy thinking, or when you start not being able to remember things very well, or it's like different aspects of brain function, realize that you've already possibly had a tremendous amount of loss of brain cells. Now, there could be other things that cause your brain function to be, impeded, right? So it's like if you have a lot of toxins in your system, that could affect it without necessarily having brain cell, neuron loss, okay? But just recognizing that if you have a lifetime of exposure to MSG and other toxins that damage brain cells, right, that over the years you are accumulating damage. And you might not notice any effect of it for a really long time. And when you start reaching the point where your brain is not functioning very well anymore, to some extent, it's kind of too late. Not that you can't do things to protect the remaining brain function that you have, okay? And not that you can't do things nutritionally to maybe regain some of the ground that you lost. But just understanding that it's really important for your long-term health and brain function to reduce your exposure to chemicals like MSG. Because if we know that MSG damages neurons, kills them off, right? Why would I intentionally or, with awareness, continue to choose to consume those things? Just saying. It doesn't make sense, right? So it's like with that awareness, I now read labels before I buy packaged foods. And if a food includes ingredients that I suspect may actually contain MSG, I'm going to evaluate a little bit more strictly about whether or not I'm going to buy that food. Now, the truth is occasionally I do still buy foods with suspect ingredients, knowing that most of the time I don't consume them. So how do you recognize when a packaged food has ingredients that are likely to contain MSG? Unfortunately, knowing that people are choosing to avoid MSG, food manufacturers are finding ways to include it in their foods so that we want to eat them without actually putting it on the label. And here's how that works. The FDA has said that you have to put it on the label if it's an ingredient all by itself. But if you have an ingredient that is composed of many different things, all you have to do is put the name of that ingredient on the label, because it includes all sorts of different things. You don't actually have to say MSG if this group ingredient that you have contains MSG. So here's an example, okay? Hydrolyzed protein or textured vegetable protein. Those are ingredients that always contain MSG. Whether because the process of making the ingredient makes monosodium glutamate or monosodium, free glutamate, basically a free glutamate molecule, okay? If the process of hydrolyzing protein makes free glutamate, then that hydrolyzed protein contains monosodium glutamate. The process of creating textured protein, textured vegetable protein, right, turns the proteins that are in that material, turns them into free glutamate, at least some of them. The process of making the ingredient makes free glutamate all by itself. Okay? And then, a lot of times what they do is they add more glutamate to it. So I think I read in Russell Blaylock's book that I've already talked about that textured vegetable protein, for example, or hydrolyzed protein, for example, may contain 60% of that ingredient could be MSG. And they would still be following the labeling rules by putting hydrolyzed protein on the label, even though 60% of that ingredient is actually effectively MSG. They're not hiding anything. They're putting the name of the ingredient on the label. They're just not telling you how much monosodium glutamate it contains. So, any label that has textured protein or hydrolyzed protein on it, I just don't buy that. Now, there is a website called truthinlabeling.org, truthinlabeling.org, that has a list of all of the ingredients that are known to contain MSG. Names of ingredients that always contain manufactured free glutamate is another name that they're starting to call MSG, but it's basically MSG. Okay? So they have a whole list of ingredients that always contain manufactured free glutamate. And then they have names of ingredients that often or usually contain manufactured free glutamate or that make manufactured free glutamate during the process of making the ingredient. And then they have a list of ingredients that are suspected of containing MSG, right? So it's like in the list of ingredients that always contain MFG, glutamic acid and glutamate, monosodium glutamate, monopotassium glutamate, calcium glutamate. So you can see that they say glutamate in some form. Okay? Anything hydrolyzed, any hydrolyzed protein, calcium caseinate, sodium caseinate, yeast extract, torridal yeast, yeast food, and yeast nutrient always contain MSG. Autolyzed yeast, gelatin, textured protein, whey protein isolate, soy protein concentrate. All those ingredients and more always contain MSG. Always, always, always. And then a bunch that have it usually. Okay? Common ones are, bouillon, I would say, bouillon always does. If you see stock on a label, that probably contains MSG. Flavors, natural flavors, I don't trust seasonings and spices. Spices of all of those is most likely to be just spices. But really, if something has just spices, I want them to list rosemary and garlic and peppermint. I want them to list the actual herbs and spices that are in there. I don't trust it if it says spices. But that's me, right? Seasonings certainly is going to have MSG in it. Okay, brewer's yeast, malt extract, maltodextrin, super common ingredient, maltodextrin. Natural flavors, flavoring, stock, bouillon, carrageenan. Carrageenan is in a lot of processed foods, including milk substitutes. Soy milk, almond milk, right? Those are going to contain carrageenan, which will often have MSG in it. Often contain or produce MSG during the processing. So just being aware that all of those things are out there, and you can detect a lot of them by reading labels. Now, I believe it's possible that some companies put ingredients into foods and don't put it on the label at all. You kind of have to go with whether or not you trust the manufacturer. Just saying. Right? Do you trust the people who are producing this food? Do you trust the store that you bought the food from? Do you trust the restaurant to have reasonably clean food? So if you want more information about how to read labels and look for MSG, go to inlabeling.org, and I will put that in the comments when the video is back in the Facebook page. Okay? Thanks. That's information about monosodium glutamate. This is Sandra Lee with miracleinspirations.com, the Breathe Life's Inspirations blog, and the Your Health and What You Can Do, Your Health on Stress and What You Can Do weekly blog. Have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.